And now I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker. We have Carmen coming up. Carmen is helping the team at Nationwide introduce DevOps practices such as continuous delivery and some other agile methods. So Carmen's going to be telling us more about that. Please welcome Carmen.
So, I'm Carmen. I get to talk about this. It's a pleasure for me to be here. The people who actually get to make this work are sitting elsewhere in the auditorium, so they'll keep me honest. And I guess if I had a couple jokes, I could tell those. One thing I want to point out, because I've been told this before, is really what makes this talk good is the graphics, which have been provided by Megan Kruger, who's our graphics designer. So kudos to Megan. And then no lights on the clicker is probably not a good thing. I don't know, but that's okay. I said I could just do this as a TED Talk. It just wouldn't be as good as a TED Talk. So, Nationwide. Everybody here probably knows about Nationwide, right? Lots of different businesses that we're involved with. Insurance, retirement plans, pet insurance, number one. One of the 100 best companies to work for, which we're very proud of. Fortune 100 company. From an IT perspective, we actually have over 9,000 folks now, I believe, including contractors. Our journey kind of started, although it really wasn't a DevOps journey then, because what was DevOps like 7, 8 years ago? But the journey really started with the idea of trying to get more work done in an agile way consistently. So, you know, again, there are people here who helped start that process of how do you go from doing a couple projects agile to where you actually have a consistent way of doing agile across the enterprise. So we had actually what we did was, I'd call it an experiment, right? We started with a few teams, we centralized them, and we said we're going to create a standard way of doing agile, right? Still allowing for innovation and continuous improvement, but in a way that we could actually grow that across an enterprise. So what started with about 3 or 4 teams 7 or so years ago now is over 200 teams doing work. You know, over about 2/3 of our work is actually done through those teams, and it's growing every year. And we have established practices, continuous integration, test, and delivery. So it's really, you know, that was a successful experiment as we were able to expand that across the enterprise. So we had we had some good results, right? Our quality went up, our productivity went up, you know, on-time delivery went up, availability. So it's a good story, right? So it's sort of like we can just fold up our tents and go home, right? It's good, we've done this, everything's great. Well, not really, as Lee Corso would say, not so fast, right? There's more to the story. So about 3 or 4 years ago, we were starting to look at DevOps, and we're starting to look at our end-to-end process, and we were saying, well, when you really look at the entire delivery value stream, from the concept of work all the way through the deployment of work, what we've really done, not necessarily by design, is optimize the middle of that value stream. So if you look at Agile and the focus on typically design, develop, and test, what we see is work does not continuously flow into that team, but once the work gets into a backlog of an Agile team, we can go very quickly, right? We can see the work, we have visual system management, everything's transparent, we have our iterations, you know, it's a beautiful thing, but when you get to the end of those iterations, the code doesn't automatically, magically get deployed into production, right? So we have two sort of wait states if you're looking at our value stream. The first is flowing work into the teams. How do we get this work going into the teams so that they're not starved for work? Because starvation is a form of waste because you're wasting your most important resource, which is your people. And then once we get through the agile iteration process, how do we more quickly get that work into production and really move away from sort of a time-based release approach where we're sort of waiting for a calendar or waiting for an opportunity to release to go to a more readiness-based approach where we can say, once this system's code is certified to be ready for deployment, we should be able to make it available for deployment. Now, that doesn't mean that we're forcing deployments onto our customers who may not be ready to get them, right? So it's not continuous deployment, but it's having the delivery capability to make things available when the customers can take advantage of them. So when we started to look at it from this perspective, we said, okay, what's getting in our way here? And there's a number of things that came up, right? The first one, and people get tired of me talking about this locally, is variance, right? So technology's cool, and we're going to hear a lot, I'm sure, about technology in the next few days. But if you have a lot of variance in how you do things, then it's going to be hard to actually create a good technology solution around that. Because essentially what you do is you take your process debt from all this variance and you turn it into technology debt when you try to implement that in a system, right? So what am I talking about here? So things like work intake. So everything starts, you know, if you worked in Lean and thought about Lean, everything starts with work intake, right? So we have around 20 different business-facing IT areas, and we all use the same tool, but we're all very ingenious on finding different ways to use it, right? So a lot of variation on how the work comes into the teams. Other things like our path to production. A lot of variation in terms of, you know, the logical environments or the quality certifications that we apply in order to say something is ready for production. Even though we have a common methodology, we still have a lot of variation, and variation would be okay if it was adding value, right? There is value-added variation because, you know, for mainframe, things are going to be different than they are for Java or for .NET, right? You're using different tools, you may have a different concept of things like continuous integration. But a lot of our variance was not value-added, it was just historical because of the way things had started, based on the fact that not only did we have silos across plan, build, and run, we also had silos in these business solution areas. So that's one thing that, you know, is an inhibitor. The other thing to talk about is the annual planning process, right? So when you're trying to when you're doing Agile, and a lot of times you're trying to insulate, you know, some of the financial management processes that you may have, and that can be a challenge, but at a certain point, if you're doing annual planning and you're having all this demand coming on an annual basis rather than a little at a time, that can be an inhibitor to continuous flow. You know, dependencies. If you go up to a team, if you go up to an Agile team and say, what slows you down, right? Why can't you go faster? The answer is going to be, I'm waiting for something. I'm waiting for an environment, I'm waiting for work to come, I'm waiting for another team to do something, I'm waiting. If you actually look at the actual time it takes to do the valuable work, it's not as much as that entire cycle because of all these wait states. Going along with that is kind of a lack of integration. Right? So if you don't have integrated processes and you don't have integrated technologies, then it's sort of like the plumbing in your house. If it's not all working together, you're not going to have continuous flow. And typically what you see is work starts in one area with one tool, like a portfolio tool like Clarity, and then maybe there's spreadsheets that portfolio leaders use to plan their work, and then it may go into your Agile team and your tooling that you're using there, right? A Rally or Rational Team Concert or whatever, and you have very good visibility for a while. But then again, it drops off the face of the earth as you're going through the rest of the process through deployment. So it's very hard to manage that flow of work because you don't actually see it, and the technology tool chain you're using is not necessarily integrated. Lots of manual activities, right? So DevOps, a lot of key DevOps practices, how do we automate things, right? But it's not just automating testing, right? It's automating how you certify versions of code, how you automate some of your other release management capabilities. How do you provide more data in an integrated way to make that job easier? Again, I sort of already talked about the lack of visibility, right? It's hard to manage something that you can't see all the way through the process. So it should be no surprise that we can have initiatives that look like they're doing well, and all of a sudden at the end they run into trouble because we really couldn't see everything. Sometimes I use the analogy of a basketball coach where you don't really get to see the game, right? If you think about our executives, they really can't go to Gemba and see all the work from end to end. They can go to parts of it, but they can't really see the entire flow of work. So if you were a coach and you had to sit in the locker room during the game and a manager brought you statistics, and then you find out maybe you lost and say, okay, go coach the team for the next game, it'd be like, well, it'd be nice if I could actually see what's happening. But I think because of the lack of visibility, we put ourselves in that situation many times. And then the last point is, and I don't think, I think large enterprises can relate to this, a lot of your time and money is spent before a single card gets into the backlog of an Agile team. There are very protracted planning processes. Again, if you have a yearly cycle, that sort of feeds into it. So we're spending a lot of time not determining the one or two highest priority things that we want to feed downstream, but these 50 things that we're going to bundle in this huge release, and all that time our teams are waiting for work, so they can start to move the delivery forward. So, how are we trying to approach this from a continuous delivery perspective? So how many people have read the Phoenix Project? Gene's becoming a richer man by the day. So, he should be giving us should be getting some fees from him. So anyway, Gene talks about 4 types of work. So who can name the 4 types of work that Gene talks about in the Phoenix Project? And Bill, I think it's Bill, the main character, struggles with this for a long time, and I think Eric's the lean guru who keeps telling Bill, what kind of work do you have? And Bill's like, get away from me, what are you talking about? So what's one type of work? Just yell it out. Business value work. That's my plan. Okay, what's another type of work? Right, operations, changes, that kind of work. And then the last type, which he struggles the longest to identify and really was killing him the most, and that was what? And that's the thing we really don't want, but we have to deal with, especially if we have poor quality. Unplanned work, right. Very good. So, it seemed to make sense if we're going to follow this model, we need to identify our work intake, right? We're building this continuous delivery pipeline. Where's the work coming from? So we're kind of lucky because we do have some standards around some of these tools. So we have Clarity for business value work. We're implementing ServiceNow for some of our operation and changes, and we have Quality Center for defects, right? Now again, I said having a single tool is nice, but then you can still have people very ingenious about different ways to use it. So we had to spend some time, on standardizing that work input. And we use TaskStop, which is a technology that syncs data across vendor tools. And then we brought that in for release scheduling. So we were already using RTC for agile work planning, but we said we want to tie that to these application changes that we're doing to support the initiatives that are coming through the process. So we have visibility of that gets scheduled into releases, and then using Urban Code, we have the ability to see all the impacts to that work as it moves into deployment, and we have the ability, as we get better, to automate some of that. So the idea here was to provide, as we talked about on the last slide, some integration capability, right? And so, I have specific tools up here mostly because I just trying to make it a little real, right? There's lots, no offense to the IBM folks here. No, there's other ways you can do this, right? So this is not a promotion of certain tools, but this is our story, and just to make it a little bit real. So to make it a little more real, I have that picture, which is kind of hard to read. But it also shows how we're bringing in other things like the continuous integration from Jenkins, right? So you now have an integration between the actual work that's being planned and the code that's being built as you're seeing it move along the path to production. And the goal here is by providing more visibility, you're also providing more opportunities for automation. And another goal is to provide the business areas with the ability to go as fast as they need to go based on their own determination of risk and value and speed. So it's not unusual in a huge enterprise to sort of have a concept of sort of the slowest common denominator, where you slow things down to make sure everything can meet your quality criteria before you go into production, because obviously quality, is very important to our customers. But once you have achieved the level of quality, you need to look at how can I allow certain areas to go more quickly based on their own needs. Now, sometimes you'll hear the terms two-speed IT, bimodal IT. Not a fan of those terms, because to me they're like I'm building a car that can go two speeds, right? I don't want a different delivery capability for things that can go faster or slower. What we want is a highway that everybody can utilize based on their needs, right? So if you're taking a trip with a bunch of school kids in a van and you're going to be very careful and you have lots of time to get there, you go slow, and that's fine. If you have a regulatory project, you have a legacy technology that you have to, it's harder maybe to do, and if Rosalind Ratcliffe from IBM was here, she'd be beating me right now because she's saying, no, mainframe can go just as fast. But anyway, that's fine. But if you have a Porsche and you can afford a Porsche and you know how to drive fast, then drive fast, right? I don't view our role is to tell the business how to do their, how to balance how fast they need to go. Now, if you want to go fast, then there's some things that there's things that you have to be able to do though also. You better have some automation, right? You better be able to validate that when you're making changes very quickly that you're maintaining your quality. You have to have the ability to go quickly through your design, develop, test cycles. So the onus is more on the areas to determine how fast they need to go and allow the tooling to take advantage of that tooling. Now, of course, there's always going to be some enterprise standards that you need to enforce around, performance, certainly security, but you can integrate that information also into your tool suite so you can see where you are in terms of these performance tests have been run, the security scans and everything have been run, and this is ready to be released. So it's not taking away the quality assurance function. Sometimes I get the question of, well, this looks like you're you're giving all the keys to the developers and they're just going to drive in the ditch, and then other people are going to have to come with the tow trucks, right? Because we've been with the tow trucks at 4 a.m. in the morning. So you have to balance that with there's accountability that you have to take in order to ensure that what you're delivering is going to meet the quality criteria that's necessary and the security and the performance that's necessary from an enterprise perspective. So again, the idea here is to provide more visibility, provide more real-time information. It also, one of the boxes up there says delivery opportunities, right? So question is, well, how are you addressing this flow issue, right? If you can't really at this point change some of the financial processes, I still maintain that with visibility, you can help connect the backlog of your agile teams with the portfolio work that's going on, so they can see that they have opportunities to schedule work and flow that work through the process more continuously. That's something that we're starting to work through right now in our journey, so I don't have any data yet, but the hope is that will help drive some of this continuous flow from the beginning of the process. Again, this allows you to see more of your dependencies. I know we'll probably have talks later about microservices and things like that, and those are great things, but a large enterprise is going to take a while with legacy systems, right, to move to a model where you can do smaller things more frequently. So when you're still dealing with a lot of legacy systems and a lot of interdependencies, you need to be able to see for a given initiative, what are all the dependencies I have across systems, and if something moves, how is that going to impact something else that might be targeted for that same release? And then it also ties, again, the whole planning, release management, deployment capability together instead of disparate things, that were in different tools, and you had to be in that tool to get a different view of that work and a different process. So what I talked about was sort of one part of the model, but there's really more about DevOps than continuous delivery, right? So I joke a little because my boss is Tom Pater, who actually has a book out this week on Lean IT Field Guide. I don't get any royalties from that either. But he has a model that looks more like a Greek Parthenon, and it's like, this is just a house, so it's not quite that good. But it's the same concepts of, what is our foundational model? So at the bottom of the model, again, from a Phoenix project perspective, you'll notice are the 3 ways, right? So system flow, amplify feedback, continuous experimentation, right? So we already had concepts in our environment. We had started in Agile, we had started around Agile. We also had a Lean program, so people understood concepts of visual system management and standard work and waste and value streams. And so we could build on top of that, right? Because one of the questions sometimes would come up is, well, what's the difference between all these things? What's Lean and what's Agile and what's DevOps? And really, the way we like to talk about it is DevOps is kind of the engineering component of Lean IT. And that's our model for us, right? For everybody, it's going to be different because it depends on where you are in your journey. A lot of areas start with Agile because that makes sense, Agile and CI and continuous test, automated testing. In our case, given where we were building on top of some of the foundational elements that were in place. So then we came up with, practices and culture. And a lot of this relates to the DevOps, State of DevOps report, which I referenced, I think, on the next slide. So practices, again, this probably is not anything new to folks, right? And you're probably already doing some of this. Sometimes talk to other companies and they'll say, well, we're not doing DevOps. Well, you probably are. I mean, you're probably doing some kind of version control, at least of source code. You may not be treating infrastructure like code, but you're doing some version control. You're probably doing some kind of continuous integration, some types of automated testing. Now, when you get into things like automated infrastructure, right, that's something that might be newer, or that's something that's come along a little later than some of these other concepts. And how do you provide some of those self-service capabilities from an infrastructure area? And then again, continuous delivery and monitoring, which is an important aspect, right? As you release into production, how are you monitoring to get feedback, both from an operations perspective, but also from a business value perspective? So we're starting to do things now around A/B testing, where we try to do something to see if we get better bind rates or better sale rates out of policies by giving the customer an A experience versus a B experience. So that's very important to collect that statistical data then to say, yes, you got a significant improvement from that A experience, so you want to feed that back in and you want to send more customers through that A experience. So the whole idea of providing this kind of capability to run more experiments, get things to your customers more quickly, see what is really giving you value, and then driving that back through that feedback loop is very important. And it's all around that amplified feedback loops and also continuous improvement. Now, the culture side, I actually think is harder. So, technology is great. There's lots of technology available, and it can be challenging, and it's fun. But if you don't get the culture right, the technology is not really going to probably give you discernible results, right? Because, if you don't really have a culture where people are empowered, right? If you really haven't addressed the whole variation issue, where people understand that this role has this work associated with it, and whether I'm in area A or area B or area C, there's some consistency to that. That's very important from a cultural aspect. The other things from a cultural aspect are these whole concepts of automation and what does that mean to people, right? And am I losing control because now something that I was governing is now being automated? Well, sort of yes and no. I mean, yes, there's always going to be some criteria around that automation, right, for certifying something's ready for production. But the fact that we're automating it actually is giving us resources that can be spending on more value-added time, right, than doing manual tests, right? So it's not essentially about we're looking for ways, right? It's for giving people an opportunity to do things that could be more valuable, and how do we take advantage of that? Because the business always has more stuff for us to do, right? It's not like, we only have this much work for you guys. If we can do our work faster, I'm sure we're going to have opportunities to do more work. And it's kind of balancing that innovation, right? So a lot of times this sounds like, standard work and all this stuff sounds like you're not allowing people to be innovative. But there's a way to balance, discipline. It's kind of disciplined innovation, right? You want to balance having some level of standards and standard work and consistency in your tooling and processes with a continuous improvement mindset of I'm always trying to make this better. So no matter where I am today on my journey, whatever data I have, I'm always pushing to make that better. I'm always looking for more opportunities, to move forward and give better results to our customers. So I sort of talked about the State of the DevOps report. If you haven't read it, I think it's a good read. I mean, basically what it says is that companies who are applying some of these practices and who can deliver more things or less things more frequently, right, not only are getting a faster lead time and being faster delivery to their customers, but they also have higher quality and higher productivity, which can sort of go against some of our thinking sometimes, because I think there's a sense that if we batch a lot of things together, then we can actually reduce the overhead of that work and move and be more productive. But it's actually, that doesn't play out. And it doesn't play out because of all the dependencies that you have to manage with the large batch sizes, right? So moving to this kind of model, which is not simple, right? And it's looking, you know, it's turning the ship away from large project initiatives to more of a product-centric focus. And how do I get the most important things that a product owner wants through this pipeline and release it more quickly, get the feedback from the customer, and then turn that crank more frequently? That's a big cultural change in the organization. Concepts of self-service, again, are another cultural change they'll talk about a little bit more. So I was lucky enough, along with Courtney and some other folks, to be at the DevOps Enterprise Conference last month, and I'm just going to roll these out. These are kind of some of the themes that I took away from that, right? From one year to the next, because this was the second year for the conference that Gene Kim has in San Francisco, you could really see the areas who had invested in their stories. So I like to say in some ways DevOps is free in the sense that what you're trying to do is a better way. Instead of doing a set of local optimizations, it gives you the opportunity to do things more holistically and actually save you money, right? There's still an investment with sponsorship and senior leadership and making sure that you are able to have, you know, some shared vision and some roadmap that you can execute on. And you could see that the companies that have done that in the last year had made a lot of progress. A lot of increased focus on lean practices. So I would say the first year, the difference between the first year and the second year is you had a lot more people. Not that technology isn't important, it is, and there was a lot of technology sessions, but there was also a lot of sessions around the value stream and lean practices and how do we apply some of these manufacturing concepts, not just to Agile, but to the entire value stream. Again, technology important, but culture's critical. Having this culture of experimentation and continuous improvement, continuous, you know, education. A lot of the companies at the conference who were making a lot of gains have their own internal education systems. We have that. We have something at Nationwide we call Teaching Thursdays, where peers can teach peers 2 Thursdays a month on, you know, some practice or technology concept or whatever. Having that in your environment, investing in the growth of your people, right? So a lot of the lean concepts around respect for people and engagement of your people, that's an important concept from a DevOps perspective. Self-service, and more self-service, right? So if you talk to devs or developers, right, it's like, I want to be able to do more stuff, I want more control, etc. Talk to ops, you know, it's kind of this model between, I don't want to miss the boat and I don't want to, but don't sink the ship, right? So, you know, it's like, yeah, you want the keys, but again, I only have so many tow trucks. So how do you provide that self-service? Well, if you want self-service, then again, it comes back to reducing the variation, right? I can't automate configurations if every configuration is a snowflake, right? So automation requires patterns, and patterns requires reduced variation. So the onus is back on the development teams working with infrastructure to say, what are the patterns I really need, right? As we started to work through Urban Code, you know, we found out we had I don't know what the right number is. They know over there. Like thousands of different deployment scripts for seemingly the same types of applications. We don't need thousands, right? We maybe need a dozen, I don't even know, but it's not thousands. The right answer isn't 1,000, it's not 100, right? So if we expect automation, if we expect self-service, right, then we have to focus on what are these patterns and sticking to these patterns that we really need and add value so that we can get those things more quickly and eliminate those wait states. You know, I think at this point, Agile and automated testing are kind of table stakes. So, you know, if people are going to be serious in this space, those are things that you have to be addressing. And I think one of the areas that there's still this kind of a uncharted frontier is this whole front end of the value stream. A lot of the discussions and talks start with your code commit to code deployment, which is very important. But I still think how do you get this work to flow and get into your teams is something that there's going to be more focus on. Because if we can't continuously flow it, then we can't really take advantage of some of the gains we're making from our agile and continuous testing, continuous integration practices. So where do you start? And I got about a minute here, so I'll go pretty quickly, right? It's, again, it's good to look at your delivery value stream, prioritize what opportunities you have, run experiments. You got to go through that plan, do, check, act loop, feedback, run experiments, see what works, see what doesn't. Start with model lines, start small, right? Create a pattern that you can then apply across the enterprise. You know, and then if you can fund this in a holistic way, I mean, one of the things that's very important is to manage all this work in progress so it's visible. That's another problem that they got into in the Phoenix project is they had too much work in progress and it wasn't visible. It's the same thing with your continuous improvement activities. You need to manage your work in progress, you need to prioritize them, and you need to go through them so that you understand you're really addressing what's important from a bottleneck perspective. So here's where you sort of get cheers, you know, final 5 thoughts, okay. You have to think horizontally. So you have to think across the value stream. We have to get out of our silos. We have to help people to think horizontally, understand their role in the entire delivery chain. Again, local optimization is kind of the enemy of lean delivery, right? So we have to make sure that, you know, when we're doing optimizations, again, are we really addressing a bottleneck or something close to the bottleneck? Because if we're not, you know, from theory of constraints, we could be making the problem worse. If you optimize before the bottleneck, you're creating more inventory for your bottleneck. If you optimize after the bottleneck, you're creating more wait states for areas that already were waiting for work, right? So do you really understand and are you really addressing some of your key issues? Again, I already said this, right? We have to get away from the snowflake. We have to understand what our value-added patterns are. Again, hard to manage what you can't see. And, you know, finally, again, I think technology is the fun part, but you got to also pay some attention to culture and get the culture right. So there's Gene's book, also Jez Humble's book, and with that, thank you.